Dr. Fritz Riveron.
I'm going to see if this mic works. Can you hear me pretty well?
Very nice.
Perfect. Gentlemen, it is an honor to be here. I have really enjoyed my time in this group over the years. The speakers have all been just very impactful for me in my life. I hope I can come anywhere near what they have done for me in my life. I'm going to talk to you about something a little unusual. I'm a doctor, and I thought, well, what do I talk to this group about? And I turned up the volume. If I can find Heather, otherwise I'm going to hold you a little closer. Let's see, is that better? That's better. Yes. Or I can hold this for the time being, Joe. We're in the midst of a pandemic, and we could talk about the COVID pandemic at length. I'm sure everybody's tired of hearing about that. But the real pandemic, I think, in this country and in the Western world is the moral pandemic of our time. If you stop and think about what's happening in our culture seems like it is in such a point of division. There's so much controversy about almost anything that people don't agree on even basic things about truth and science and fact. So this group here, you are all very accomplished. You are fathers. You are leaders. What I wanted to do was call you all and call myself out to take a stand and be leaders in a time of this moral crisis. And so to do that, we look around and we can be passive observers about what's happening in our culture, or we can be active participants. And I'm going to call you all, with your talent, to be active participants, and that means to speak up. So, as we know biblically, very unusual people have been asked to lead for the Lord, right? I mean, Moses supposedly couldn't speak very well. Jonah, if you look back, Isaiah 6:8, and I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Well, how about you? How about me? Here I am, send me. This is really what I want to talk to you about. Because when you think about what's happening in our culture, just turn on the TV for a few seconds. It doesn't seem that things just don't make any sense whatsoever. Doesn't it seem like we're arguing past each other? I mean, you talk to someone and it seems that we're just on completely different levels of basic understanding about logic, reason, truth. I'm a doctor, and science is in question nowadays. We don't know what science is. We don't know what fact is. When you ask somebody, well, is that true what you just said? This COVID pandemic has really brought this to the fore. I mean, we actually have difficulty even understanding the basic reason when we discuss with somebody of a different point of view. Well, this moral funk, is that okay? This moral funk that we're in is not new. So this is a poem that many of you have probably seen before. It's by Yeats. It's called The Second Coming. This is an apocalyptic view of what was happening in the beginning of the 20th century. Is this appropriately loud, gentlemen?
Yep.
So Yeats had this apocalyptic vision of what was going on. He wrote this in 1921. If you think about it, this is between World War I and World War II. A terrible time. And if you read what he says here, he says, "The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is dying." And listen to this: the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Isn't that what's happening in our world? The best people have to be quiet. I mean, you get canceled, doxxed, you lose your job, and the worst are out on the streets. They're full of passionate intensity, destroying the very underpinnings of our culture. So this was in 1921. The 20th century was the bloodiest century in the history of mankind. And not just the two world wars, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. And this is really the point that I want you to take away from this talk. I'm a fan of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is a philosopher of the 20th century who you hardly ever hear about, because she was a very conservative philosopher. And she said contradictions don't exist. Wherever you think you are facing a contradiction, stop and check your underlying premises, because you're going to find something underneath is wrong. You know, it was one of the errors of my youth where when I talked to somebody who disagreed, I always presumed that they saw the world the same as I did. And then it became very clear, and you guys are probably wiser and have seen this before, it became clear to me that we were starting at different premises, and that if you dissect where the other person is coming from, then you start understanding where their thinking differs from you. So when things don't make sense, examine not just the premise, but the ideology underneath. The ideology, because, for example, politics is a reflection of underlying ideology. And this talk is not about Republicans or Democrats. It is not about any kind of tribal positioning here. What I want you to understand is, where do you stand ideologically? Where do I stand? That when you live your life, you have to have an ideological concrete basis where you assess what's good, what's fair, what's value. And each of us has to understand where we stand personally. But politics is a mirror of the people's ideology underneath, right? And our ethics, the concept of right and wrong, depends on underlying ideology. Seems correct? The psychologists nowadays are calling this a meta-narrative. Okay, so essentially a meta-narrative is just the story that you accept from the time that you're a very little kid as to what reality is about. What's true, what's fair, what's good, what's bad is a meta-narrative, and it defines our view of reality. So when we disagree with each other, where does this come from? So anyways, I'm going to tell you a little story about me. And so in 1956, this little kid was born in Havana, Cuba. And that was a very tumultuous time in Cuba. So Cuba was in the midst of a storm that would come in and bring an ideology that we had never seen before, communism, and brought this ideology in such a way that it undermined the entire social fabric of an entire country. It destabilized religion, politics, the social contract that we have with each other, destabilized everything for an entire generation, and in fact it's still going on today. Cuba is a police state today. But at the time, when Castro came in, imagine this, 3,000 men, a rabble, Castro had never succeeded at anything. He comes in and with 3,000 men, he takes over a country that is very militarized from a dictator. Well, how did he do that? Well, some of it was propaganda. The New York Times, he was on Life magazine, he was on the Ed Sullivan Show, so he became a hero. He was lifted up as he was going to be the savior from tyranny, from Batista, who was a dictator and had essentially controlled the Cuban government for about 20 years. Castro was very popular. Everybody was out in the street. Everybody bought into this overwhelming feeling that somebody's going to save us and give us freedom, right? And at first, it seemed that way because Castro initially came in and very specifically said he was not communist. But once he came in, he got rid of all the existing powers. He assassinated all the leaders of Batista's regime, and then he started putting his own people in all the levers of power. And when he did that, he then took over the schools, and he started indoctrinating kids, and then he took over the monetary system, he took over the banks. Unbelievably, he put an avowed communist, Che Guevara, and murderer, as the head of the monetary system. So they got rid of private property, they nationalized everything, all the farms, everything. No one owned anything, and then they took over your bank account and changed the currency. So suddenly nobody had money and nobody had property. And then they said, well, by the way, we are communists. And the ideology that was present that led to people being vulnerable to this coming in, Cuba was ripe for it. There was inequality, and nonetheless, communism took over. So in 1962, I don't know if you saw on the previous slide, but about 250,000 Cubans left Cuba around that time. My family was among them. I was among them. So I left right after the Bay of Pigs and before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in that crazy period of time, me as a 5-year-old shows up to the United States. And I remember this battle between, the evil forces of communism and capitalism. But back to the original point, these aren't just power structures, these are ideological positions. There's a huge difference between Western philosophical thought and communist thought. Western philosophical thought is about private property and individual rights. Communism is all about collective rights being more important than the individual right. So that was the ideological battle. It manifested as the Soviet Union versus the United States versus the West. But the ideological battle was central government versus individual rights. So my father, interestingly, was handed this book. This is the book that changed my life. This little tiny book. I don't know if you all remember this book, but it's Animal Farm. It's an allegory of a farm where the barnyard animals decide that the farmer is a tyrant and he's oppressing them. So they kill the farmer and they take over the farm. And then the barnyard animals try to run the farm, and it turns into a story of death and destruction and murder, and the pigs are the ones that are ultimately the ones that win, and they are slaughtering the rest of the pigs, and everybody else disagrees with them. So when my dad read this, he was handed this as, if you want to understand communism, read this book. So here's the themes from Animal Farm, and you may remember some of this from school, those of you who read it. They're obvious, the sinful nature of man, okay? Power corrupts, corruption by communist ideals. The ideology of communism is you can't have God, because if you have God or family as important to you, you will not succumb to the power of the central state. So anything that spreads out that power, they have to X out. So corruption by communist ideals, godless collective rights, the dangers of passive and ignorant population. Right? People said, well, Castro, this is just politics, it's going to go, don't leave the country, are you crazy? You can't be passive in the face of evil. The dangers of propaganda in the power, especially today with social media and with all the powers that are aligned together to push an ideology without any discourse, is a danger. And the need to create a common enemy to gain control. Every totalitarian, every tyrant works by triangulation. They are going to save you from another evil that is so much worse that it's important that you give them all the power so they can fight. So Castro was fighting against the United States imperialism, and to this day he was a revolutionary until he died. Revolutionary. Revolution against what? Well, it's a revolution against the evil empire of the United States. And so the people had to succumb to his power structure. Well, ideology. And what I really want to focus on this, because I want you all to dissect what's happening in our world on the basis of what's the underlying idea that is motivating this. So in the 1800s, these are the first words of the Communist Manifesto. A specter is haunting Europe, a ghost. The specter of communism. Well, indeed, Karl Marx, his push was to say that all of history, so he looked at history like it was called historical materialism. He looked at the scope of history as being all about oppressor and oppressed. That there's a class struggle where the people in charge of the means of production are oppressing the people who are the workers, who are the real people who should be the owners. And that's spread throughout not just all of Europe, but throughout all of China. So the rapid spread of communism into all of that, which was probably abetted to some extent by the world wars. Right after the Second World War, I think people were just tired of warfare, and they allowed Stalin to take all of Eastern Europe all the way into Germany, which led to slavery for all of Eastern Europe for decades. I know you can't read this, but I just wanted to show you these bubbles. 20th century death. The bloodiest century in the history of mankind, okay? So, what causes death? And so if you measure in 100 years, well, it's infectious disease, it's heart disease, it's stroke, all those issues. But I don't know if you can see, there's a bubble kind of in the center there that is humanity. And humanity is, air pollution and accidents and that kind of thing. But among the violent forces of death in the 20th century, communism is the largest number. World War I and World War II led to about 100 million deaths. The ideology of communism led to 94 million deaths. Think about that. So just, and what does that mean? 94 million deaths. Those are their own people. So this was Stalin with the Gulag. This was Mao with the Cultural Revolution. But this is a quote from Stalin, just so you see how your underlying value structure creates what your politics is. A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. Famous quote. But I don't know if you can read under there. The greatest killer of all time in the history of mankind, Mao Zedong. 60 million of his own people. By starvation, by sending them to concentration camps, or because of the Cultural Revolution. Just behind him, Joseph Stalin. We hear a lot about Hitler because he was an evil tyrant, and he caused a lot of death. But communism, by far, has been the greatest source of bloodshed in the 20th century. This is, I just thought we'd like to see this here. These are all the tyrants. I mean, these are all tyrannical leaders. And look at the blood next to Mao Zedong. Now, if you go to China, you'll see gigantic posters of this man. I mean, and ideology trumps action. In communism, the end is always justified by the means is always justified by the end. And so death and bloodshed is a necessary consequence for the social construction that they want to create. Well, I was looking for a poll, and this is just, unfortunately, this is 10 years old, but in 2011, 11% of Americans thought that communism would better serve this country's needs in our current system. Think about that. What do you think it is today? When you saw what happened last summer, there were people out in the streets, many of them with actual communist symbols, talking about redistribution. And so why is that? What is going on in our world or in our culture? And this is not new. I mean, that poem was from 1921. That is making people question the very fabric of our culture, our ideology. We look at this world we live in, and the fact that we would be willing to destabilize it because of some kind of ideology. So let's go into that a little bit. This is another little book, and you may start thinking that I only read little books, but this is one of the more pivotal books of the 20th century. This is Viktor Frankl. I don't know if you've heard of this, but he was a concentration camp survivor. He was in Auschwitz, a psychiatrist. He was a disciple of Freud, and Viktor Frankl survived the concentration camp and then had his own theory as to how to do psychotherapy. And what he felt, so in this book, he writes Man's Search for Meaning. And so his point was that it's man's natural inclination, each of us, to have some meaning in our lives. When you're a baby, you're trying to evaluate, well, what's going on in the world, and what does this mean? And so you establish a sense of reality. But meaning can be your family, it can be God, it can be suffering. It's something that gives you a sense of purpose for what you're doing on this life. But without a sense of meaning, he noted that people go through an existential crisis, meaning that people get neurotic or they have mental illness if their life doesn't seem to have any meaning. Well, extrapolate this to an entire culture. What happens if a culture has no centralizing meta-narrative or history or story that says this is who we are, this is why we're here, this is why we work our tails off. I mean, if we don't have that, people get this kind of neurotic feeling. I mean, doesn't it feel like it's like that in the United States today? Like there's sort of this weird neurosis, like people don't really know what the meaning of their life is. So, I love history and philosophy, so you've got to bear with me for a few minutes. So what is the meta-narrative that has led to the United States being where it is today? The shining light upon the hill. Okay, so the meta-narrative, the story of Western civilization started back with the Greeks when they first started penning manuscripts. And it started with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and then went to the church fathers, and led eventually to the scientific revolution and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and to our time. So it's an ideological progression of thought that is based on this stuff. If you can read it there, it says, science and philosophy can find truth. There's real truth. There's truth out there. It's the language of God, or it's natural order, whatever you want to call it. So the world can be understood, and those truths are for real. We see them through a glass darkly, but our job is to try to see reality. The Buddha, interestingly, he called it right vision. That there's reality, and you've got to get it right. You have to try to see it right for you to live a good life, right? The perfect things are unchanging. And so a little more history lesson. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, a brilliant monk from the 1200s, wrote some very interesting things about. He wanted to prove the existence of God, but also the structure that creates our ethics and what's right and wrong, etc. And he wrote, and now this is a big book, okay? So not just little books. But in this, he wrote that truths are naturally implanted in us as human beings, so that we may call it common sense, we may call it the Spirit of God implanted in us. But truths, he said, was self-evident. But there's some things that are just obvious. That when you're a little kid and you're in the playground, when you see fairness, you know what fairness is. That's not fair. You're a little kid. Nobody has to tell you that. There's some basic implanted truths in us. But so this had to presume the truth was something eternal. To Thomas Aquinas, it's from God, and it's a natural law, including God's natural and moral law. So Thomas Aquinas led our Western thinking. That kind of thinking led all the way to the time of the founding fathers in the 1700s. Because you know what Thomas Aquinas was saying? He said these are truths that are self-evident. You don't have to argue about them. Everybody knows these are true. And so then these thinkers were right around the time of the inception of this country. So Thomas Hobbes wrote this book, Leviathan. And so he was a believer in central government. He believed that the monarchy should control things because there's a social contract. But he believed that people in the government enter into a social contract together, and that the government's job was to ensure that these natural rights that were given to us by God were effectively treated in society. John Locke is the guy that he should have been one of the founding fathers. He was a British philosopher, politician, and he wrote, people are basically reasonable and moral, but they are given certain natural rights, and a government has a duty to make sure that those natural rights are preserved, and if the government doesn't do it, we have the right to rebel. So John Locke was the fire that went behind the founding fathers to start the American Revolution. And then to add, Baron de Montesquieu, he wrote, well, wait a minute, human beings are all corruptible, so if we give anybody power, we're going to have checks and balances. So does that sound familiar? One of the most beautiful passages written by mankind. Okay? From Thomas Aquinas to Locke, Montesquieu, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. What truths? The eternal truths, that there's truth out there, right? And they're self-evident. Of course, everybody understands these truths, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator, the eternal, with certain unalienable rights. This is the meta-narrative of Western culture. This is what our country is founded upon, and this is the story that we should all be. In business, you usually have like a vision statement. This is the vision statement of the United States. So this contributes to a meta-narrative for the justification of equality and natural rights of mankind. Now, this has come under fire recently, right? And for some very good reasons, slave owners, etc. But the idea is we're corruptible human beings, but there's an eternal good that we're all trying to see through this opaque glass, and we're trying to get there as good as we can, but there's an eternal truth. Another small book. This is a crazy, brilliant book. C.S. Lewis was one of the best Christian apologists. We may know him from Chronicles of Narnia, etc. the symbol of the lion. But C.S. Lewis, in this book, he gets back to the idea that what Viktor Frankl said, that you have to have a meaning to your life. There are eternal truths, and that we all understand, and most cultures around the world understand that these eternal truths are what we should strive for in order to live a meaningful, good life. So you may have heard of this, but this is called the natural law. And so the natural law, and this is in C.S. Lewis's book, but it's also the basis of our legal system. In the East, so C.S. Lewis's point is, it doesn't matter if you're Christian or not Christian, the entire history of mankind, people have understood that there is truth, and that it's a self-evident truth, it's implanted into you. So in the East, they call it the Tao, the T-A-O. And so C.S. Lewis uses this a lot. It's called the way. It's the natural way to live. It's a good way. It's the way that makes you feel you're in harmony with the universe or with God. The Greeks called it the Logos. You know, much of the Bible, the New Testament was written in Greek, right? So remember John, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. The Logos is the active element, this eternal truth present in the universe that makes the universe, this galaxy spin and the earth rotate. The Hebrews called it wisdom in Ecclesiastes. Self-evident truths is the same thing, but that's what it was called by the founding fathers, trying to remain with some secular position. An atheist might call it first principles, and a physicist will call it cosmic order. But it's a concept. This is the Western, I'm trying to say that this is the Western meta-narrative. This is the history of mankind in the Western world. There's truth. We can find it. Newton called it the language of God. He comes up with calculus, and then he figures out how to detect the exact motion of the planets. And he says, I've just figured out God's language. This is the cosmic order, but mathematics is just proof that there is cosmic order. So this Tao, or the way, or Logos, is the sole source of unchanging judgment and truth. And it's not from man, it's transcendent. So transcendent. So think about people that you know in your life. Think about young people that we know. Or, and not to beat up on young people my age, who just focus on the daily life. And life is all about what's in front of them, the material, what we're doing tomorrow. Their transcendent thought is something that is almost foreign to this culture today. People who are God-fearing we go to church and we have transcendent thoughts about the God Almighty who's blessing us every day. But by and large, in our secular, European and American and Canadian life, transcendence is not a concept that people really focus on anymore. So in this book, reality isn't what it used to be. This is a really fascinating little book. He says that we are in a conceptual shift as profound as any in human history. But what's going on right now, if you read the philosophy of today, this philosophy of today is very troubling, because the philosophy is trying to make the point that there is no truth. There is no absolute truth. The truth is a matter of our own personal perceptions, and that society creates truth. Today, I will put it to you, as I was saying, that we need to stand, and we need to stand for something, whatever you feel personally is the meta-narrative of your life. Stand up and say what it is. But as a society, we've lost our overarching meta-narrative. We've lost a sense of here's our story, here's what we want, and this is what it means to be an American, this is what it means to be a leader in the 21st century. And why is that? We've had a breakdown of belief, right? This pandemic, this COVID has really shown us that there's been a breakdown of belief. People don't even know what's true anymore. We can look at the same data and say that the conclusions are diametrically opposed. So and again, pardon me for being a little pedantic here, but I love philosophy and history. So What's happening is that the philosophy of the past was a philosophy of what led in that line through modernism all the way through the scientific revolution to the Enlightenment. The philosophy of today is something called postmodernism. Now, we talked a little bit about this, but it's the battle in our world today when people don't understand each other is that some of us are absolutists. We believe that there's absolute truth, and the truth is not something that I make up, but that it's eternal, and I'm trying to figure it out. And there are people who are relativists, and they believe that there really is no absolute truth. The truth is whatever is convenient for society, or whatever society decides is appropriate for today, that is more modern. That's the battle that this country is in the midst of right now, and you may call it a spiritual battle, but it's a moral battle where we've lost our moral compass. So if nothing is eternal, and only man's perception is important, then what's truth? What's equality? What's equity? Nowadays it's not equality anymore, it's equity. What is tolerance? And sorry, these slides are a little crowded, but so what happens if you have a relativist philosophy? Okay, suddenly the world becomes an unregulated marketplace of ideas. All ideas are equal. All ideas are equivalently important. If you don't like the idea or you think it's wrong, you're intolerant, and you have to allow that kind of thinking as a matter of diversity and tolerance. There's been a globalization of culture. Right? So we're exposed to so much on the internet and on media, et cetera, and we're exposed to ideas that are diametrically opposed to the Western concept that I grew up with. But the problem with not the problem, this is an opinion, but the result of relativism is that people get divided into interest groups. And so you're no longer identifying with the eternal truth. You're not a child of God. You're not a child of the universe. You are now identifying yourself as a Latino or Latinx or a white or a black and so the identity then becomes one of separation and of creating like Marx and like socialism, creating aggrieved groups of that are based on power structures. Nietzsche very, everybody knows this line. Nietzsche said, "God is dead." Well, but what he said was not that God is dead. He said, "We killed God." And what he was trying to say was that society doesn't need God anymore. That we've gone beyond God. We don't need these eternal truths. We've come to understand that man is the center of all things. And so Nietzsche, remember, he was in Europe right before the onslaught of the 20th century. His thinking led directly into all the issues that happened with totalitarianism, because his idea was the will to power was the only meaningful thing in the universe. That power and power hegemony from groups was the only thing that mattered. There is no eternal truth, there's no eternal good. It's like whoever's in power and whoever wields power, that's the meaning of life. This was Nietzsche. Ended up in an insane asylum. But my point here is ideology matters. What you believe is truth matters. And we are in the middle of this developmental phase in our culture where we're fighting about what is true. So this is Arnold Toynbee. He wrote about 12 volumes where he examined 23 civilizations, and he came up with a relatively radical point of view that civilizations occur in cycles, and that the cycles were, people come together, they grow, they become powerful, and then eventually all these civilizations fail. So he tried to analyze why civilizations fail. He's the guy that came up with the term postmodernism. So postmodernism is the philosophy of the non-Christian Western world. So he said that societies, these 23 societies, he felt they fell apart because of a schism of the soul. They lost their cultural narrative. They lost the thing that brought them together as glue that said, this is what we believe, this is who we are. They started losing that. And that schism made them fragmented. And so societies abandoned moral cohesion, not just physical cohesion, but moral cohesion. and they submit to sort of the melting pot of ideas that make them all fragmented. So he also famously had this quote: "Civilizations die from suicide, not from murder." He felt that most of the civilizations he examined did not fall apart because they were conquered, but they conquered themselves. They fell apart. The Roman Empire is a great example of this. The Roman Empire fell apart because they lacked cohesion. In fact, Cicero, the famous Roman orator, said, "The enemy is not at the gates, the enemy is within us." Now, imagine this. This is from Le Monde, the French magazine. And the whole concept was that wokeism, was an American invention, and that it was creating a suicide of America. So imagine the French saying this to us. But Toynbee also said this, to be a little more positive. He says, "I don't believe that civilizations have to die because civilizations are not an organism. It's a product of the will. So that ideas matter. Ideas can change things." And so here's one of the greatest mass murderers in history. Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why would we let them have ideas? Joseph Stalin. Now, does that sound like what's happening in our culture? You can't express an idea without being completely canceled. This was a very recent book by a CEO who quit so that he could write this book, Woke Inc. The confluence of American money and media with the concept of wokeism. It's very, very interesting. If you ever want to hear a podcast of blow your socks off, I mean, this guy he's brilliant. We've heard of people being woke. And so this is a concept that was born in the United States. Okay? It sees society through a lens of pure power dynamics. It recruits the forces of self-righteousness. You feel good about yourself because you're an activist trying to promote equity. Equity is, what's the difference between equality and equity? Because if you talk to people nowadays, they're pushing equity. This word popped out of nowhere. Equality is equality of opportunity. Equity is forced equalness, right? But this is what's in our national space right now. Tolerance and diversity. Who can say tolerance and diversity are bad? Of course not. Oh my word. But tolerance, to me, I grew up with tolerance being respect for differences of opinion, but understanding that that person may still be wrong, but you're going to respect them. Well, tolerance now has to be that you accept everybody's differing opinion, even when you think they're wrong. And you can't speak differently because you're out of the orthodox and you will get canceled. People will pile on. Diversity, well, diversity to me used to be, we are the children of God. Flowers pop up in the garden and they're all beautiful different colors and types and fragrances, and that adds to the beauty of the children of God. Diversity now is separation of people into little lacunae of interests. Like, they're spreading tribalism, essentially. I'm not an American, I'm a Latino. The concept of tolerance and diversity has been stolen by this wokeism. And incredibly, it's being supported by moneyed interests with huge amounts of money. I mean, you can see it in the NFL, you can see it in football teams, on the backs of helmets. You can see it with Nike. That the self-righteous sense that you're a good company then becomes that you agree with this woke mentality. In this book, Woke Inc., and I'm sorry, I'm probably going over. He says something that I think is brilliant, because I'm the kind of guy that if you face me with something that I think is crazy, I'm going to tell you, hey, I disagree with that. It's kind of crazy. Well, he says that the antidote isn't to fight wokeness directly because it's a losing battle. And I don't know if any of you have been canceled, but you know that this has happened to me. I've spoken up about something, and holy man, you get attacked on social media. People are trying to fire you. You get vilified if you go against the orthodoxy of the day. So he's saying, if you want to fight directly, you're going to suffer. But he said the solution is to rebuild a vision for a shared American identity that is so deep and powerful that it dilutes this wokeism. So in other words, strengthen your side, not denigrate the other side, as you may think. This is long, but a nation that puts God or family ahead of man will have a very difficult time descending intellectually and societally into the abyss of pain and tyrannical darkness. Communism, the first thing they do is they make religion illegal. First thing they do. China, Cuba, Soviet Union, because internal truth is not subject to legislation from a central power or politics. So where do each of us stand? So this is the obvious for all of you who have read this. This is one of these militant commentaries from St. Paul in Ephesians 6. Therefore, put on every piece of God's armor. Stand your ground, putting on the belt of truth. What is truth? And the body armor of God's righteousness. In addition, hold up the shield of faith so you're protected. Put on salvation as your helmet. This is your consciousness that we are not of this world, that God has saved us for eternity. And take the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. That's how we fight. The last thing I want to say is when Jesus was faced with temptation, at the Mount of Temptation, his response was always, "It is written." And we've been given a battle manual. We need to be in the Word, and we need to understand who we are and what we believe in and where we stand, and not suffer the personal slings and arrows, but try to be leaders, particularly with our children, in our families, in groups like this, and in our society as best we can. So, thank you, and God bless you all.